They said it was just a rat. Noise at night, old wood. My friends laughed, said I would get used to it, that every roof sings, that every old house talks. I tried to believe them, but I swear, what I saw that night, it didn't have paws. It had eyes, and it was closer than I imagined. I remember the light breeze passing through some crack I never found, footsteps that seemed like mine but came from above, the tiny creaks marking the time between one fear and the next. And beneath all of that, deep down, almost like a sigh from the house, a slow, muffled drag, patient, as if someone was drawing an invisible line over my life. My name is Susan. I'm speaking softly because that's how this story exists inside me, in a smaller tone, with contained breaths, as if every word could bring back what I don't want to see again. I thought I knew my house. I thought every noise had an owner, every creak had a time. The fan out of tune when it cools, the hidden clock that insists on ticking in the bedroom when I want to sleep, the crickets reminding me that the world outside still breathes. It was comfortable, until it wasn't anymore. The first times I heard that thing dragging, I thought of the rain that hadn't yet fallen. I thought of a branch brushing the roof. I thought of a cat. My heart always tried to give me an answer first, before my mind began to tell stories. But it wasn't footsteps. It wasn't hurried little points. It was lines. A body crossing the house without hurry, cutting through my ceiling like someone pulling a heavy hose over old boards. And, every now and then, a muffled thump, a warning that something on the other side of the ceiling had enough weight to show its presence, and enough lightness to hide when I held my breath. I started to listen differently. My house had a secret. Sometimes I would breathe, and the air would return with dust and a strange smell, sweet and nauseating, that I couldn't name. I spoke to the house. I whispered, "It's okay," as if the walls could answer. And they did, in their own way. When I walked slowly through the hallways, the ceiling would respond with a more distant drag. When I stopped, the silence would fall, heavy, to the ground. And it was in that silence that the thump would appear. Dry, short, like a coin falling in the dark and vanishing. I thought about calling someone. I thought about moving out for a few days. But there's a kind of fear that grows not because it's big, but because it's constant. It doesn't run. It walks from your bedroom to the kitchen, comes back, leans against a wall, makes a mark, steps down a stair, climbs another. You follow the trail you don't see, but feel. And then, one night, my flashlight found what I couldn't imagine. Before seeing it, I heard it. A heavy slide, like thick fabric dragging wood, but organic. I turned on the flashlight, and the beam cut through particles of dust that looked like slow snow. And behind the dust, shadows. At the edge of the light, two round shapes reflected a damp golden glow, as if they returned the light with a delay. It was seconds that stretched time. In that instant, everything I thought I knew about my house turned into scenery. Everything I thought was just wood, breathed. And I was certain of what I feared most to admit. Rats don't return light. Rats don't open their mouths with a dry breath that seems to turn off the air in the hallway. When the flashlight found the texture, I understood the word scales with a shiver. It was like aiming at a lake and suddenly seeing that the surface is skin. I lost my ground inside, and everything became very still. I remember my own breath coming short, scraping my throat, and the feeling that any noise I made was an invitation. For a moment, I didn't exist beyond my ears, and in that space, suspended between what I heard and what I saw, the house became so silent that it hurt. If I had turned off the flashlight there, maybe I would have invented another story to sleep. Maybe I would have told myself it was a log, a trick of the light, a piece of deformed insulation. But I kept the light on, and the light left me with no excuses. The line I followed in the nights, the drag, the thump, all gained form. A long, heavy body, coiled over the beams like a second structure. My house wasn't empty. It was occupied. And there are occupants who don't knock on the door. I stepped back. 1 step, 2. The trembling flashlight cast shadows that danced around the eyes, and the eyes didn't dance. They only knew how to return the light, watchful, ancient. I walked backward toward the hallway, careful with every board, as if my weight could turn into an invitation or a threat. I closed my mouth, so the sound of my breathing wouldn't say where I was. And even without words, I spoke to that thing, with a sentence I didn't need to say. I heard you, and now you've seen me. That night, when I sat on the floor of the hallway and leaned my head against the cold wall, the certainty no one wants came. The story had already begun before I noticed. I had only entered the chapter where I appear. The rest had already been written on the ceiling. I am a primary school teacher in Gainesville, Florida. I'm 43 years old, live alone, and bought this wooden house because I've always preferred things with a past. An old stove that takes a while to light. A crooked shelf that always forces me to organize the books in a way only I understand. Windows that creak to remind me that the wind exists. In the first month, I fell in love with the sound of the roof during thunderstorms. It didn't just sing. It told me I had a place to be. I went to bed early, woke up with the sun, and when the night came, the house rested with me. The crickets keeping the rest of the world outside, the fan marking a rhythm that, over time, became intimate. The noises up high had always been there, sometimes a hurried swallow, other times a creak, as if the wood stretched its back after a long day. I gave names to the sounds, the sigh of the kitchen, the step of the bedroom, the cough of the hallway. It was almost a game, an alphabet of the house that only I read, and I liked it. I said the wood spoke to me, and that we were understanding each other. The house seemed to settle into my routines, and I settled into its, until the words changed. You know when you hear something familiar, but a tiny detail turns the familiar into strange? The sound that came didn't have the light dance of the little steps from before. It didn't have that nervous rush that small creatures have when they know they're being heard. It was a confident sound, a continuous line that crossed the ceiling without asking for permission. Imagine pulling a thick hose over a wooden floor. The sound doesn't jump, it drags. It has mass. It imprints a path. And when the house is silent, this line scratches your head like a heavy pencil. I tried not to pay attention. I forced myself to leave the TV on longer, to pretend I hadn't heard. But when I turned everything off, it was as if the house waited for exactly that moment to resume a conversation that only it was willing to have. The line would start above the living room, pass through the hallway, and linger over my bedroom. Sometimes a dry crack, like an old nail considering whether to come loose. And on certain nights, a vibration so subtle I only noticed because the chandelier hesitated, an indecision I could feel without seeing. The objects started to participate. A book that slipped for no reason. A mug I swore I had left further inside the shelf would appear with the handle on the edge. I caught myself speaking softly, asking permission to pass under the ceiling of the hallway. I started to walk carefully around the house, as if my weight could also be read from the other side. And it wasn't fear yet. It was a distrust, as if I were being watched by someone who doesn't have eyes, and yet sees. It was during this phase that I created a mental map of what I called the invisible map. I knew where the sound started, where it turned, where it got heavier. I took notes without paper, on my body. My shoulder knew when the curve was coming. My nape knew when the thump would come. I made dinner with half my attention on the garlic in the pan and half on the ceiling. And when I lay down, sometimes the ceiling seemed to breathe. Not a human breath, a shifting of weight, a stretching and contracting, as if the house had two rhythms, Mine, of chest and lungs, and hers, slower, broader, coming from above. One night, the shelf in my room decided to speak. I was already lying down, the book open without any desire to read, and it was as if a wave had passed over the ceiling and down the walls. A pair of objects fell together, and the noise threw me out of bed. I stood still, in the dark, trying to hear what came next. And what came was a silence so defined that I could hear my clock, which had always been shy. The ticking seemed to beat in my chest. I whispered, "It's okay." But the phrase came out more for me than for anything else. The next day, I climbed on a stool to look at the ceiling in the hallway. I didn't know what I was looking for. The dust made a pattern I couldn't read, but there was something there, a cleaner strip, a trail with no paw prints, and I thought, maybe it's just an impression. Maybe I'm seeing patterns because I need a cause. My body didn't believe it. It registered the smell. It wasn't mildew. It was a sickly, sweet smell that clung to the memory of my nose. And when I got down from the stool, I knew that, sooner or later, I would open the attic door. Not to satisfy curiosity, to give it a name. Up to that point, I had still flirted with simple explanations. Opossums, big rats, a nest, a branch, the wind. The old repertoire we used to sleep. But something inside me, quiet, already knew that the house was divided into 2 floors. The architectural one, with its rooms, its kitchen, its roof, and another, invisible one, that someone was walking through above me, redrawing the paths of my life. I just didn't know who. Not yet. On Saturday, I grabbed the aluminum ladder. It was a simple gesture, almost trivial, that weighed like a decision. I opened the legs of the ladder in the narrow hallway, the metal making a sound that always seems louder when you don't want to draw attention. My heart went ahead, as if it wanted to climb first and return with a report. I touched the attic door and felt a different temperature leaking through the cracks. A denser, warmer air that carried a sickly sweet, heavy smell clinging to my throat. The kind of smell that seems past, but is present. The flashlight clicked, and the beam cut through the dark up there with a clear line that raised dust. It's amazing how dust becomes everything when you shine a light on it. Each grain turns into a slow star. I carefully pushed the door open, breathed shallowly, and raised my head. The insulation looked like a crumpled field. They weren't random marks. They weren't footprints. It was a smooth, continuous trail, as if something had passed through there repeatedly, clearing a path with its own body. A lower strip, shiny from so much contact, following the beams like a patient drawing. I said out loud, without recognizing myself, "It must be an opossum, or a big rat." It was a sentence to fill the air, an attempt to bring the world back to a size I know. My voice sounded small, and the attic didn't return anything. I swept the flashlight slowly, and it found small droppings here and there. Not many, not what I'd expect from an infestation. The silence up there had a sticky quality. I could hear my own breath scraping the metal of the ladder, hear the flashlight against my sweaty hand. And at that moment, I didn't see what I would see later. I only saw the path. And sometimes, the path tells more than who makes it. I went down slowly, closed the door, and promised myself I would call an exterminator. At night, I decided to lie down earlier to prove that I still controlled my routine. The bed recognized me, the fresh sheet, the book open without desire. The lights went off. I was going to leave the TV on in the next room, but I didn't want to give myself the favor of the noise. I wanted to know. It took a few minutes for the silence to settle around me. The fan cut through the air, the distant ticking marked its presence. And then, as if someone was waiting for my body to surrender to the mattress, the ceiling trembled. Not once. In waves. Something, passed over my head, and the bed vibrated with a discord that wasn't a truck rumbling on the street, not a wind effect. It was close, direct, as if the house were breathing above me. The first impulse was to turn on the light. I stood still in the impulse. I clung to the dark because the idea of confirming with the light what I felt in my body seemed worse. The seconds counted by. Then, from the shelf, a pair of objects decided to fall, not as an isolated accident, but as a response. I got up slowly, the cold floor under my feet, and walked to the hallway. The air felt thicker beneath the ceiling. There, the contained thump appeared, a small weight hit that says, "I'm here," without saying anything else. I went back to the room, grabbed my phone, and started recording. I didn't know what I expected to record, but I knew that when you place a microphone between yourself and fear, fear gains details that sometimes help you survive it. The recording captured what my ears had already learned: a thick, rhythmic drag that doesn't hurry. A sound that compresses the wood and lets go, compresses and lets go, as if it were crossing the house in a straight line, without tripping. Between one compression and another, micro thumps spaced out, small weights indicating curves, changes in intent. And mixed with this, at certain moments, something I never thought I would hear in a house: a breath rubbing against wood, a puff that doesn't expel air, it pushes presence. I spent hours listening and re-listening to what I had just recorded, as if confirming repeatedly could make the sound have less power over me. It didn't. I called an exterminator early in the morning. He answered sleepily, listened to what I had to say in a cowardly summary. "There's noise. It must be a rat or an opossum," and promised to come by tomorrow morning with traps. I thanked him like someone thanks an adult arriving home late, and I waited. Between the phone call and the dawn, I didn't sleep. I sat in the hallway, leaned my back against the wall, and listened. Listening became a heavy verb. For the first time, I realized that the rest of my life now fit between one crack and another. I planned lessons with my head supporting the ceiling with my ear. I made coffee, paying attention to the click of the coffee machine and the absence of clicks above. And when the hours passed without dragging, I didn't feel relief. I felt the preparation of silence. That's when I understood. When you start listening to your house for real, it starts telling you the truth. And it's not always a story you want to live inside. The exterminator arrived in the late morning, a middle-aged man with a humor that seemed made for small creatures. He brought a box of traps, looked at the ceiling, climbed 2 rungs of the ladder I had left ready, and froze. His face drained in a way that knocked me off my feet. He descended so slowly that I understood before I heard. "Call someone specialized," he said, without looking at me much. "This isn't for me." And he left. I was left with the hallway, the open ladder, and a silence that didn't seem like just an absence of sound. It felt like a decision the house made not to help me. I breathed. Once, twice. I went up. My hand was sweating on the metal. The flashlight felt like a commitment. I lifted the door again, pushed it more firmly, and the warm air hit my face like old breath. The light cut through the dark and made a path through the dust. And then, the texture changed. The beam found a volume that my mind tried to turn into anything else. Long, still. Resting between the beams like a log someone had forgotten there. But logs don't have skin that captures light. Logs don't have that pattern of yellow and brown, opaque scales of dust, and yet, alive. A thick body, coiled like something that knows how to make the space its own shape. I didn't want to look at the extremes. I wanted it to be just that. A segment. A part I could ignore. But the flashlight moved, and the shadows gave way to 2 points that reflected the beam back with a golden, damp, ancient shine. Eyes. They didn't blink. They just existed before me as a fact. The air entered my throat with a sound like paper. I took a step back without meaning to. The ladder vibrated with my body. I knew the name before I said it. I knew what a student in my class would have said, excitedly, pointing in a book. Burmese python. The word Wade. The phrase inside me, the one I'd been avoiding to say, finally took shape. What lives in my ceiling has no pause. I turned off the flashlight for a second, and the dark hit me like a bad hug. I turned it back on. The snake didn't move. It didn't need to. It was home. I went down, sat in the hallway, and dialed the animal control number with fingers that missed twice. The voice on the other side sounded practiced and calm. "We'll send a specialist." I thanked them like you thank someone for a favor you don't know well. And I stayed there, phone in hand, listening to the ceiling like you'd listen to a seashell pressed to your ear. Sometimes a single dry crack came, like an old nail remembering it's there. Sometimes nothing. The nothing, when you know there's a life above, is louder than anything. I thought of my students, how I would say, in words that wouldn't scare them, that their teacher had spent the night with something that could hug without arms. I thought of what my mom would say. "You slept there? You stayed there?" I thought that I hadn't left because, in some twisted way, I felt responsible for my house, like we feel responsible for an animal we find in the yard. And I knew the house was now divided into two planes. The one below, where I decorated with class photos and mugs with messages. The one above, where an ancient presence rested in the heat, drawing paths in the insulation. When the truck stopped in front, a breath of relief and fear came in the same air. The specialist seemed like someone who had learned to move his body without startling the world. He looked at the ceiling, listened to the little I could say without stumbling, opened a toolbox, took out an iron hook, a tube, a thick sack. He spoke little, with a calm firmness that gave me a bit of backbone. "It will work," he said without making promises. He climbed. I stayed in the hallway, almost in the same place where I had sat the night before. The phone in my hand, not to film, but because it was what I knew how to hold when there was nothing else. The silence before the first touch of the hook on the beam was a silence I will remember until the end of my life. When the iron touched the wood, the house responded, not with a frightening noise, with an adjustment. A weight shifted, and the screws of my courage gave way a little. I heard a low, dry hiss, a sigh that wasn't seeking air. It was rubbing presence. I took a step back involuntarily. The specialist said something to me, or to it, I don't know. And then, the house changed its shape. Half the body of the snake descended through the hole in the hallway ceiling, with a decision unhurried, and the head appeared at the line of my room. I saw the mouth open, not like an attack, but as a warning, and the discreet, sharp fangs gleamed for a second in the light. I felt my feet find the corner of the room before I did. I pressed my back to the wall, held the phone like it was an anchor, and counted my lungs to remember to use them. It was big, but what scared me most wasn't the size. It was the certainty with which it used the house. Every beam was a handrail it knew. Every box stored on top was an obstacle it accepted moving. The ceiling was a map of muscles. And I was, down there, a figure that tried to become smaller. The specialist's flashlight touched her body in fragments, scales, folds, shadows, and never the whole, and I think that was better. Seeing it all would have broken me in a way that maybe time wouldn't fix. For the first time, I saw that my fear had a concrete reason. And along with that, I saw that there was a path back to silence. It would be long, and it would require strength I didn't have, but someone there did. I just needed to let it happen. The specialist spoke little. His body worked at the rhythm of the house, as if he had learned to breathe in places where air fears to make noise. He positioned the hook with calm, brought the tube, opened the thick sack that looked more like a tent than a sack. I was in the hallway, 1 step from entering and 3 steps from fleeing. When the rod touched the beam with measured weight, the house responded again. This time, it wasn't just an adjustment. It was a decision. The snake pressed against the wood. The sound of the press wasn't loud, but it was definitive, like the house remembering that, before being a ceiling, it was a tree. Half of her body was already hanging through the hole in the ceiling, drawing a heavy S in the air of the hallway. The head emerged in my room, and I swear that time made a noise inside me. The mouth opened, and that dry breath, unlike anything we learned to hear, cut through the space between us. It wasn't an attack. It was a reminder that there was an animal there with a very unique way of saying, "I'm here." I stepped back without thinking. The corner of the room found me, and I became part of the wall. The specialist remained calm. "It's okay," he said. "I don't know to whom." The hook tried to guide, not pull. With each touch, the snake found another leverage point. It coiled around the beam, slid across a box, dragged another, shifted an entire shelf a few inches. The ceiling groaned, not dramatically, but remembered, as if every screw was telling the story of when it held wind, rain, sun. And now it held a weight that seemed natural because it came from a body that knows how to use every fold as a tool. I discovered that my body has a limit to how long it can stay without air from fear. I was holding my breath without realizing. With every dry puff it released, my lungs opened a centimeter. I trembled in my fingers and forearms, not from the cold, but from the effort of not crying and not running. The specialist murmured, with a patience that seemed timeless, "Calm. This. Slow." It was almost a mantra for the animal, a reminder that the path to the sack wasn't a defeat. It was an inevitable transition. The snake resisted like heavy water. Everything in her was leverage. I saw an old box, full of photos and things I didn't have the courage to throw away, being pulled with an ease that hurt me more than I admit. As if the house were telling me that memory weighs less than I imagine. I heard the wood sing in an arc when she used 2 beams like they were steps. The specialist kept the hook low, the tube ready, the sack open like a new threshold. He explained quickly, without taking his eyes off. When the head enters, the body follows. Don't pull. Guide. Almost an hour passed without a clock. I measured it by the sweat on my temples and by the number of times my body forced me to breathe. At times I had the impression the snake was looking at me, but maybe it was just the light betraying the curves of her eyes. I wasn't important in that negotiation. I was the scenery, and that for a second calmed me down. Because when you become scenery, the threat stops being personal. It just is. And in is, there's less cruelty. The moment everything gave way didn't have a film climax. It had an accepted weariness. The snake loosened its grip on a beam. The hook gently guided its head, and the tube offered a path. The bag was ready, and it was like watching a strap untie itself. The body entered slowly, heavily, not like something that loses, but like something that occupies a new space. The thick fabric scratched the sound in a way that seemed safe. I heard the drag of the bag on the attic floor, the wood responding with a low arc. And when the mouth disappeared into the fabric, the specialist closed the bag with a metallic click that sounded like a period. Not the end of the story. The end of a chapter I had endured with my teeth. The house breathed. It's strange to say, but that's what happened. The air circulated in a different way, lighter, as if the entire structure had unbuckled a belt that had been pressing just a little too tight. I felt my back loosen, my chin drop a millimeter. I cried, not from fear, but from relief, and from a gratitude almost childlike directed at a house that held on with me. The specialist came down with the bag in a way that didn't ask for help. I offered hands that wouldn't serve. He shook his head, a gesture of, "I've done this before," and left me with the only thing I had to do: breathe. He placed the bag in the truck with a care that surprised me. There was no hatred, no disgust. There was respect. I stood at the door, watching the truck carry away something that, for weeks, had shared life with me without asking for permission. And for a moment, I missed the sound. We get used to even what scares us when it scares us slowly. The silence seemed like another animal, harder to name. But I knew since the click of the lock that tonight I would sleep with a piece I had forgotten. After they left, the house remained silent in a way that made me almost suspicious. I spent the next few days reinforcing the roof, calling people to seal cracks I had never seen, putting up screens, closing holes that seemed more like neglects of time than doors. I went up to the attic empty of fear but full of care, tapping the beams with my hand, sweeping dust, picking up boxes. I installed external and internal cameras, as if hanging new eyes on the house. And on the first nights, I slept with the hallway lights on, not as protection, but as a witness. I wanted the house to know I was watching, that I was listening, that I was present. Relearning the sounds was a process. The fan went back to being a fan. The ticking returned to being a clock. The crickets went back to being outside. But there was an echo, a memory in the body of the silence that wouldn't give way. At times, I swore I heard a slide far away, but it was just the wind coming in through a crack I hadn't found yet. Other times, a dry and innocent crack would make me hold my breath without needing to. I caught myself talking to the house again. "We're okay," I would say, and let the phrase linger until the structure absorbed it. The specialist returned the next day with a notepad. He showed me marks on the insulation I hadn't noticed, details in the dust at the top of the door that told a story I didn't want to read. "Pythons are spreading through Florida," he said, with the neutrality of someone carrying a heavy fact. "They enter through cracks, go after rats, and stay for the heat. See here, marks on the insulation, smooth trail. Here, in the dust, at the top of your door. It came down a few times, probably at night. It may have come down through this hole in the ceiling in the hallway." He looked at me, not cruelly, but honestly. "Attracted by the heat of your body." I felt a cold wave. My voice came out low, detached from me. "I slept here, and it..." He nodded slowly. "Your ceiling served as a trail. You gave heat. It returned silence." The sentence echoed, because it held both poetry and threat at once. When he left, I ran my hand along the doorframe of the bedroom, as if searching for a signature of someone who doesn't write. In the days that followed, the house maintained a vigilant peace. I worked, returned, turned on the cameras, checked the alerts. I learned to distinguish the shadows of the neighbors' cats from the shadows of the branches in the garden. And I learned that fear, when it no longer has an immediate reason, becomes routine. We serve it water in the morning, let it sit in the living room at night, and try not to feed it with assumptions. I didn't hunt in the attic. I respected the silence. But I also respected what I had learned, that my house could have 2 floors, and that on certain nights, the floor above can come down the stairs. Weeks later, at 3:14 in the morning, the backyard camera beeped. The dry sound of the alert pulled me out of a faceless dream. I grabbed my phone with that mix of curiosity that hurts and forced courage. On the screen, the grainy image of the backyard under the light rain. A shadow climbed the fence with a fluidity I recognized in the body, not in the head. It disappeared behind the eaves. The microphone caught a light slide, almost shy, like a secret whispered softly. And at the end of the file, when I dragged my finger to hear it again, A distant hiss, breathed in. I sat on the bed, the whole house in ear. I got up slowly, without turning on the lights. I stopped in the hallway, like so many other nights. The ceiling was there, the same, mute. I touched the wall, felt the cold paint. The silence grew so full that after a while, I was sure something would happen. And it did, on a level that only those who go through it understand. A board, somewhere above, accepted weight for a second and returned to its place. It wasn't a dramatic crack. It was the smallest crack in the world. But enough to reignite an entire story inside me. I didn't scream. I didn't call. I just understood. Houses are organisms. Mine breathed with a strange life for a while, and now, perhaps, it has stored the echo of that breath in some part I can't reach. I returned to bed with the phone in my hand, but not to film. To feel there was a witness for me, if I needed one. And that night, I forced myself to sleep, not because I was calm, but because I was tired of negotiating with what doesn't owe me an explanation. If you're still here, if this story made you listen to your own house in a different way, I want to know. Would you have gone up the stairs? Would you have had the courage to point the flashlight when the silence asked? Comment. I heard the drag. I'll read it. And if you hear something tonight, don't run the first time. Sometimes what scares is just the new telling you it exists. Sometimes. And sometimes it's not. If this story gave you chills, share it with a brave friend and click subscribe on the Serpent Shadows channel. New episodes every week, with investigations no one else shows.